There is a thread running through the Old Testament that most readers never quite pull on. It appears in the opening chapters of Genesis before the flood. It surfaces again when Moses sends spies into the Promised Land, and they come back terrified. It runs through the conquest under Joshua, through the wars of King David, and it does not fully disappear until the kingdom is well established. It is the thread of the giants. We tend to think of one giant, Goliath, the Philistine champion struck down by a shepherd boy with a sling. But Goliath is not the beginning of the story. He is very nearly the end of it. Behind him stands an entire population of giant peoples with strange names: the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzummim, woven through the biblical narrative from before the flood to the days of the kings. And when you trace the whole thread from beginning to end, something remarkable emerges. The giants are not a random collection of tall men. They are a recurring obstacle, standing again and again between the people of God and the place God promised them. So today, we are going to catalog them. Every giant clan in the order the Bible introduces them. We are going to look at what the Hebrew actually says, where these beings came from, and what happened to them. And by the end, you will see that the story of the giants is not really about height at all. It is about fear and faith and a promise that no obstacle could finally stop. Let us begin at the beginning, in Genesis chapter 6, with the most mysterious passage of them all. Just before the account of Noah and the flood, the text says this: "When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives whomever they chose. And then there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." This short passage has puzzled readers for thousands of years because it contains three phrases that are anything but clear: the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. Start with the word Nephilim itself. In Hebrew, it is most naturally derived from the root nephal, which means to fall. The Nephilim are literally the fallen ones. That is why many older translations simply render the word as giants, following the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, which used the word gigantes. But the Hebrew is not primarily a word about size. It is a word about falling. Whether that means the fallen offspring of a forbidden union, or those who fall upon others violently, or beings who are themselves fallen from a higher state. The text does not spell it out. It simply names them, the fallen ones. Then there is the question of who the sons of God were. And here there are two major interpretations that have divided readers for centuries. The first view, common among many ancient Jewish and early Christian readers, is that the sons of God were angelic beings, divine or spiritual beings who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross, took human wives, and produced offspring that were neither fully human nor fully angelic. This reading is supported by the fact that the phrase sons of God elsewhere in the Old Testament, in the book of Job, for instance, clearly refers to angelic beings in the heavenly court. On this view, the Nephilim are hybrids, the unnatural product of heaven and earth mixing in a way God never intended, and their existence is part of the very wickedness that brings on the flood. The second view holds that the sons of God were simply the godly line of Seth, the descendants of Adam's son Seth who had remained faithful to God, and that the daughters of men were the ungodly line of Cain. On this reading, the sin is not a supernatural union, but a spiritual one, the faithful intermarrying with the faithless, eroding the godly line until almost no one righteous remained except Noah. The Nephilim, in this view, were simply powerful, violent men, tyrants and warlords, the mighty men of renown, not supernatural hybrids. Faithful readers have landed on both sides of this question for 2,000 years, and we are not going to settle it today. What matters for our catalog is what the text plainly says, that in those days there were Nephilim, fallen ones, mighty men of renown, and that they were associated with the very corruption that filled the earth and brought the flood. But here is where the mystery deepens, because the flood was supposed to be the end of them. Genesis tells us that everything on the earth perished except Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. And yet, read the passage from Genesis 6 again, carefully. There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And also afterward. The text quietly tells us that the Nephilim did not only exist before the flood, they appear again after it. And that single phrase opens the door to the rest of the story. Because the next time we meet the giants, it is more than 1,000 years later, on the very edge of the promised land. Moses has led Israel out of Egypt and through the wilderness, and now he sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan to scout it before the conquest. They are gone 40 days, and when they return, 10 of the 12 are gripped by terror. Listen to their report from Numbers chapter 13. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. That is the language of overwhelming fear. The spies have seen something in Canaan so large, so imposing, that they feel like insects by comparison. And they connect what they have seen directly to the ancient Nephilim. The giants, it seems, are back, or never fully left. And here the text gives us a new name, the sons of Anak, the Anakim. They are descended, the spies say, from the Nephilim, and they are the giant inhabitants of the land around Hebron. Their ancestor, Anak, was the son of a man named Arba, after whom the city of Kiriath Arba, later called Hebron, was named. The Anakim were so proverbial for their size that for generations afterward, to speak of overwhelming, unbeatable opponents, people would say, "Who can stand before the sons of Anak?" This is the turning point of the entire wilderness story, because the report of the giants is what breaks Israel's nerve. 10 spies say the land cannot be taken. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, say that God is greater than the giants, that the people should go up and take the land at once. But the nation listens to the fear, not the faith. And as a result, that entire generation is condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they have died out. The giants did not defeat Israel in battle. The fear of the giants defeated them before the battle ever began. 40 years later, a new generation stands at the edge of the land again. And this time, as they prepare to enter, Moses reviews the history of the region in the book of Deuteronomy. And in doing so, he gives us the fullest catalog of giant peoples in the entire Bible. Because it turns out the Anakim were not the only ones. Moses mentions the Emim. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, he says of the land of Moab, "The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim." The name Emim itself means something like the terrors or the frightful ones. They were a giant people who had lived in the territory that later became Moab, and they were reckoned among a larger category called the Rephaim. Then Moses mentions the Zamzummim. Of the land of the Ammonites, he says it is also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. The Zamzummim, possibly meaning something like the murmurers or the noisy ones, were another giant people in another region, again counted among the Rephaim. So we keep encountering this larger word, Rephaim. The Emim were Rephaim. The Zamzummim were Rephaim. The Anakim were counted as Rephaim. What is this category? The Rephaim are the broadest and most fascinating of all the giant groups because the word has two distinct meanings in the Hebrew Bible, and they sit in haunting tension with one another. On the one hand, the Rephaim are a living people, giant inhabitants of the land, named alongside the Anakim and the Emim, real opponents that Israel had to face. But on the other hand, the very same word, Rephaim, is used elsewhere in the Old Testament to mean the dead, the shades, the departed spirits of the underworld. In passages in Isaiah, in Psalms, in Proverbs, the Rephaim are the ghostly inhabitants of Sheol, the realm of the dead. The giants and the dead share a name. Whether this is because the giants were associated with death and the underworld, or because the word carried both meanings independently, the effect is striking. The great giant clan of the land bears a name that also means the shades of the grave. Their very name hints that their destiny is death. And one member of the Rephaim gets his own remarkable passage. His name is Og, the king of Bashan. When Israel finally moves to take the land, they encounter Og in battle, and the text pauses to note something extraordinary about him. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, it says, "For only Og the king of Bashan was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth." Og's bed, or possibly his sarcophagus, his final resting place, was 9 cubits long. That is around 13 feet. The text preserves this detail almost as a museum label, a relic of the last king of the giants, so large that his bed frame became a regional landmark people could still go and see. And Israel defeats him. Og, the last of the Rephaim in his region, falls before the advancing people of God. So by the time Israel enters and conquers the land under Joshua, the giant clans are being systematically defeated. Joshua chapter 11 gives us almost an obituary for the Anakim. Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Read that last line carefully, because it is the hinge of the whole story. The Anakim were cleared from the land, except in 3 Philistine cities: Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The giants were not entirely wiped out. A remnant survived, and it survived specifically in the cities of the Philistines. And one of those cities was Gath. Which brings us, at last, to the most famous giant of all, Goliath of Gath. When we meet him in 1 Samuel chapter 17, the text describes him with the precision of a military inventory. He is a champion. In Hebrew, the word is connected to the idea of a man who stands between 2 armies, a one-man decider of battles. His height is given as 6 cubits and a span, which by the standard reckoning is around 9 feet 9 inches. He wears a bronze helmet, a coat of mail weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear is like a weaver's beam, and its iron head alone weighs 600 shekels. He is a walking fortress. Now, there is an interesting textual detail worth knowing. While the traditional Hebrew text gives Goliath's height as 6 cubits and a span, about 9 feet 9, Some of the oldest manuscripts, including a Dead Sea Scroll text of Samuel and the early Greek translation, give his height as 4 cubits in a span, which would make him about 6 feet 9. Even at the shorter figure, in an era when the average man stood well under 5.5 feet, a warrior approaching 7 feet, armored head to toe, would have been an overwhelming, terrifying sight. Whichever figure is original, the point of the narrative is the same. Goliath is a giant, the last great champion of a giant line, and no one in Israel's army will face him. And notice where he comes from. Gath, one of the exact 3 cities where Joshua's account said a remnant of the Anakim survived. Goliath is not a random large man. He is, in all likelihood, a descendant of that surviving giant remnant, the last embers of the Anakim and the Rephaim, still standing centuries later, still defying the people of God, still blocking the way. For 40 days, Goliath stands in the valley and challenges Israel. And for 40 days, no one answers. The same fear that gripped the spies in the wilderness now grips the whole army of King Saul. The giant is once again the obstacle. And once again, fear has paralyzed the people of God. And then a shepherd boy arrives with bread for his brothers, hears the challenge, and is baffled, not by the giant's size, but by Israel's fear. David does not see an unbeatable monster. He sees a man defying the armies of the living God. He refuses armor. He takes 5 smooth stones from the brook and a sling, and he runs toward the giant. And with a single stone to the forehead, the champion of Gath falls face down to the earth. The fallen ones at last have fallen. But Goliath is not quite the end of the giants. There is a quiet epilogue that most people miss. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, we are told of 4 more giants, descendants, the text says, of the giant in Gath, who were killed in later battles by David and his mighty men. One of them, named Ishbi-Benob, carries a bronze spear and nearly kills an aging David before one of his soldiers intervenes. Another, named in the text, is described as having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, a man of great stature, descended from the giants. One by one, these last giants of Gath are hunted down and defeated by David and his men, until the line is finally fully ended. The thread that began before the flood is at last cut off in the days of the kings. So that is the catalogue. The Nephilim before the flood, the Anakim, sons of Anak in the hill country, the Emim in Moab, the Zamzummim in Ammon, the Rephaim, the giant clan whose name also means the dead, and their last king, Og of Bashan, with his 13-foot bed, the surviving remnant in the Philistine cities, Goliath of Gath, and the 4 giants who came after him. From Genesis to 2 Samuel, from before the flood to the throne of David, the giants run through the story as a single connected thread. And now we can ask the question that matters more than any measurement. What is this thread actually about? Notice the pattern. Every time the giants appear, they appear in the same role. They stand between the people of God and the place God has promised them. The Anakim are why Israel refuses to enter the land. The Rephaim and the Emim and the Zamzummim occupy the territories Israel must pass through and possess. Og blocks the road. Goliath blocks the valley. The giants are not just tall men. In the architecture of the story, they are the embodiment of the obstacle. The visible, terrifying, seemingly unbeatable thing that stands between God's people and God's promise. And notice how they are overcome. Never by Israel's superior strength. Israel is never the bigger army. The giants are overcome at exactly the points where someone trusts God instead of measuring the threat. Caleb and Joshua against the Anakim say, "The Lord is with us. Do not fear them." David against Goliath says, "You come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord." The giants are defeated every single time, not by people who were big enough, but by people who believed God was bigger. That is why the spy's words are so haunting. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. The tragedy was not that the giants were large. The tragedy was that Israel measured the giants against themselves instead of measuring them against God. And the whole giant narrative becomes in the end an extended lesson about how the people of God are meant to face what is too big for them. There is one more layer, and it is the deepest. The word Nephilim means the fallen ones. And the entire biblical story is, in a sense, about a fallen world and a fallen humanity facing an enemy too great to overcome on its own. The giants are a vivid physical picture of every obstacle that looms too large, every Goliath, every fortified city, every fear that says the promise cannot be reached. And the consistent answer of Scripture is not that the obstacle is smaller than it looks. The answer is that God is greater than the obstacle. David, the giant slayer, becomes the ancestor of a greater son. And when the New Testament presents Jesus, it presents him as the one who faces the largest obstacle of all, not a giant of flesh, but death itself, the very thing the name Rephaim pointed toward. And he overcomes it, not with a sling, but with a cross and an empty tomb. The pattern that runs through every giant story, the impossible obstacle overcome by trust in God rather than human strength, reaches its end in a garden tomb where the last and greatest enemy finally falls. So when you read about the giants, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, Og, Goliath, do not get lost in the question of their height or in the speculation that surrounds their origin. See instead what the text is showing you again and again, that the people of God will always face things too big for them, that fear will always whisper that the promise cannot be reached, and that the giants fall every time before the ones who remember that God is greater. The fallen ones fall. That is what their name always meant. If this gave you a new way of seeing one of the strangest threads in the Bible, share it with someone who loves digging into these things. Subscribe so you do not miss the next study. And leave a comment. Which of the giants surprised you most? Pray for us. God bless you.